Congratulations, you've passed step 1. I can now trust you for any example of language that I put before you or your instructor puts before you that you can tell me whether it's an argument or not. For step 2, we're going to learn how to isolate the conclusion of any given argument. Now, this is a crucial step in being able to understand what a specific argument is trying to do. I would say that a huge percentage of faulty interpretations of arguments rest on faulty interpretations of what a specific argument's conclusion is. So, what we're going to do in this step is I'm going to give you something, either an argument, or if it's not an argument, you'll be asked to determine that it's not an argument, and say, what is this argument's conclusion? The question to ask yourself at this step is, what specifically does the arguer want me to believe at the end of the conclusion? At the end of the argument. If the argument is successful, if it does what it hopes to do, what do I now hold? What claim do I now ascribe to? Now, there are some cases where the conclusion of an argument is clearly flagged. A person might say, I'm going to try to convince you to vote for this candidate. I'm going to try to convince you to buy this particular washing machine. But a lot of times in the arguments that we meet in our day-to-day existence, they're not served up to us on a silver platter. They're not clearly flagged with neon lights sort of blinking all around them. And it's worth time to very carefully identify exactly what the author is trying to do. Now, keep in mind, that's the point, is to determine what the author is trying to claim to do, not what you think the author might surreptitiously be trying to do. To isolate the conclusion and argument is really an example of thinking in good faith, being honest and fair about what this arguer is setting out to do. To pay attention to when you're isolating a conclusion in a given argument is paying attention to that argument's scope. Whether the scope of the conclusion is fairly broad or relatively narrow. Look, for example, at this claim that I'm going to make. Every Tom Cruise movie has been an artistic disaster. Now, that's a very large scope in a claim. If I'm going to persuade you that every single movie Tom Cruise has ever been in has been a complete and utter artistic disaster, I'm going to have to provide a lot of evidence because Tom Cruise has made a lot of movies. So this is a very broad scope. Now, what if I change this even slightly? Almost every Tom Cruise movie has been an artistic disaster. Now I've narrowed the scope of the conclusion significantly. By narrowing the scope, I'm going to need less evidence in order to persuade you that this conclusion is true. Now, I can keep backing up the scope. And you'll sometimes see people do this, by the way. If they're giving an argument and they're getting some critiques of it, they'll change their conclusion so that it could be more successful. So I could say, all right, maybe not almost every Tom Cruise movies, but many Tom Cruise movies have been artistic disasters. Now, I only have to give you a few pieces of evidence in order to convince you that many. I can change it again, some. What this example shows is the need to be very precise when you're isolating the conclusion of any given argument. And when I say precise, I mean precise in a way that mirrors the intention of the arguer. Not what you hope the arguer would wish, not what you think the arguer should try to conclude in order to make a successful argument, but what the arguer is actually setting out to do. This is about thinking in good faith, honestly and fairly, regardless of whether it's an argument that you're inclined to believe or inclined to disbelieve. Okay, so you want to pay attention to scope. The point about scope also brings up the importance of paraphrasing. As I said before, not every conclusion in every argument is going to have neon lights around it blinking, saying here it is, here's the argument. Sometimes the conclusion won't even be stated explicitly. Very frequently, it's going to be your job to paraphrase the conclusion rather than writing something down word from word for the original argument. Paraphrasing is not only a fair thing to do, it's often a necessary thing to do. But to do it well, again, you have to be thinking in good faith and with the motivation of accurately representing the arguer's intention. Okay? So feel free to paraphrase. In fact, you're often going to have the responsibility of paraphrasing in order to gain the best level of precision and clarity that the arguer themselves may not always provide for you. Okay, one last point about isolating arguments. One of the most difficult matters in isolating the argument is trying to find out where the argument ends. Many times, as you're getting used to isolating arguments, conclusions from arguments, you may mistake a major premise for the conclusion. Or alternatively, you may think that the argument goes a step beyond what the argument actually tries to do. Again, the emphasis here has to be on accurate representation of the argument as presented by the arguer. So let's say someone is critiquing a certain form of technology, that this word processing program is completely worthless, it's not user-friendly, it's confusing, and it crashes all the time. That's the argument. Someone might interpret that argument to be saying, therefore, everything this same company does is suspect. Well, that argument didn't claim anything about the company as a whole. It was concluding that this particular software is not valuable, not saying anything about the company or the other products that that company may make. So we have to make sure to stop where the argument stops. Now, some other arguments you may make, you may find yourself making the opposite problem. There's a great Nicholas Kristof article about contemporary slavery, where he makes an argument about the severity of contemporary sex slavery, gives evidence that it's very severe, that it's common, that it's widespread, that it imposes incredible suffering on people. And then quite near the end, he makes a claim that the United States should take this matter up seriously with a variety of their international partners. If you miss that last paragraph, you might think that the conclusion is sex slavery should be stopped, or sex slavery is serious, something like that. But in fact, Kristof goes one step further. Sex slavery is serious is a premise that supports the conclusion the United States should take this issue up with its international partners. That's one step more that the argument includes. Now, isolating conclusions can often take a fair amount of time. They may not be obvious, they may not be simple. You may question yourself, is it this word or is that word? What's the scope? What exactly is the argument trying to claim? This is time well spent. If you misunderstand the conclusion of an argument, you will not be able to evaluate it accurately. Everything else that you do with regard to this argument will be wrong. So it's a worthwhile investment of your time and energy to get this step right. Now, again, as I mentioned in the previous step, there are sometimes not right or wrong answers with this particular step. There we may argue about whether this articulation, this paraphrase of the conclusion of this argument is better than this. So, as always, you're going to be asked to back up your work. Why do you think this particular articulation of the argument's conclusion is good? Why is it accurate? Why does it function well? And that, you and I may disagree about that, may be perfectly acceptable. And then, of course, there are those cases where we can actually just make errors and misunderstand an argument significantly. So, for this step, you're going to be given examples of language, determine whether or not they're arguments first, and then isolate, paraphrase, restate the argument's conclusion to make sure you've got the heart of it before we go on to the next step. Good luck.